Okay, thank you so much, Deanna. Well, we're very excited today for our wonderful presentation by Elaine Russell. I just wanted to tell you that Elaine is an award-winning author of 3 historical novels and 6 children's books. I don't know where she's found the time to do all of this, but this writing journey has taken her down many paths. When she begins a novel, her characters take over the writing, which she said, and she enjoys very much researching these projects. She discovers unexpected events or facts that shape an entire story, and the process never ceases to really thrill her. She has a great love of travel and history, and this has also contributed significantly to her writing. And so today she's going to be talking about her latest historical novel, where When the Tamarind Tree Blooms, and there are copies for sale here if you'd like to purchase one. This particular novel is set in 1931 French colonial Laos, which, I mean, this is a really fascinating. I think we all remember the bombing of Laos and the Vietnam War and that whole terrible era. Not so much in 1931, but later. And her novel is about an orphaned métisse who is half Laotian and half French, and searches to discover her past, but she is also trying to determine where she fits into a deeply divided Laos and French society. So she's going to talk to us about her close connection to this particular beautiful country in Southeast Asia. She began her research here in California, and then she traveled to both Laos and France to further research this novel. So please welcome Elaine Russell.
Thank you very much. It's so nice to see all of you here, and also to the people on Zoom, also for tuning in. And I'm going to explain my connection to Laos, why I wrote this book, and the whole background to it and my research on that. And I actually thought I would start out by reading you the first 2 pages of the book, because it gives you a sense of the setting and the main character. So I'm going to sit down so I can manage the the book. Vientiane, Laos, May 14th, 1931. On a Thursday in mid-May, I balanced on a bough of the ancient tamarind tree, gazing over the wall of the home for orphan girls. The surrounding streets were empty, except for an ox cart rolling down the lane, its wooden wheels creaking over the rutted dirt. Young novices at the Buddhist temple across the way napped on the covered porch of their quarters, occasionally swatting at flies or wiping sweat from their brows. Most sensible people retreated inside at this hour, but I refused to be sensible. The indolent afternoon awaited relief, the heat bearing down, shimmering off dusty lanes, holding the air suspended with hardly a trace of oxygen. Even the warblers and larks had ceased to trill. With the onset of the monsoon, dark clouds converged on the horizon over Siam, across the Mekong River, tantalizingly close, inching toward town to unleash the miracle of a cooling downpour. Once more, foolish hopes filled my heart. This year, my mother would return. Only a distant, hazy memory remained of 14 years before, my mother clutching me and sobbing as a Frenchwoman tore me from her arms. "I'll come for you when the tamarind tree blooms again," Mother had called after me. Every May, the blood-orange, orchid-like petals burst into flower, holding the promise of Mother's words, and every May I waited, searching for her in the streets below. Blooms faded, petals drifted to the ground, yet here I remained, unclaimed. The same question crowded my heart. Why had she abandoned me? Where was she now? In 2 days, I would turn 18 and leave this unhappy place. I must find my mother and discover a way back to my beginning. A crown of dense fern-like leaves, the color of fresh cilantro, brushed my face, shielding me from the fiery sun. My fingertips grazed the swirling grain of the gnarled bark, the indentations and unexplained bumps, discolorations and bare spots, testimony to years of weathering woodpeckers and voracious insects, each imperfection as familiar to me as the contours of my face. The tree's strength and survival skills inspired me. For years, this tamarind tree, mock calm, as the Lao gardener called it, had grown straight and tall, expanding its lush canopy. The regal giant had thrived long before the French proclaimed their right to rule Laos almost 40 years ago, and long before the orphanage trapped the tree's sturdy trunk within the courtyard, like it had trapped me. Half the massive branches spilled over the wall as if uncertain where they belonged, attempting to escape. I sympathized with the tree's dilemma. I, too, questioned where I belonged. Half and half French, half Lao, neither one nor the other. The French word for our kind, métis, or métis, well, for girls, was rife with negative connotations. Many terms had been coined for our unseemly blend of races: half-breed, half-caste, impure, sale, or dirty, métis. Those of us at the orphanage were déracinés, uprooted, ripped from our families and native Lao culture, everything familiar, to be raised as French citizens. The Lao described us as having a touch of French blood, sometimes spoken in a derogatory manner, but other times simply as a statement of fact. We were the inevitable consequence of French men living in a faraway colony where few French women had followed. Many men took a Lao mistress, a fusao, or young maiden. In the early years, French officials chose to look the other way until the métis became too numerous to ignore. I'm going to stop there. That's just an introduction to give you an idea of the story and where it's going. So, let's see if I get that right. No, we're not.
Freezes, it's okay.
It's what?
It just freezes.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. So, yes, I have written 3 historical novels and 6 children's books. And as I, in the introduction, most of my things are related to traveling and my love of history. I have a history degree from UC Davis many years ago. And I've just always loved learning about other countries and their culture and the people. And so that has been my inspiration in many cases. So I wanted to explain my connection to Laos. And that started about almost 20 years ago. When I first was starting to write my first historical novel, Across the Mekong River, which is the story of a Hmong family who flee Laos after the Vietnam War and are eventually resettle in the United States. And it's a very difficult adjustment for them. And I became interested because way back when my son was little and in elementary school, there were some Hmong children in his classes, and I had no idea where they'd come from, why they were here, and I was really interested. And so I learned about the Hmong refugees, and then it was like karma, something was forcing me into this whole area, because then the Bee ran a series of articles about the community and what a difficult time they were having, and that really was fascinating. And then my book group happened to pick this book by Anne Fadiman, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, which I'm sure some of you have probably read, which is also about the Hmong and the difficulties of their culture and medical beliefs and so forth conflicting here in the States. So as I was writing this book, I thought I have to go to Laos. I can't just write this book and not go there. I have to go and see where they came from. So I did take a trip in 2006. And while I was there, I went to the Xian Quan province, which is where many of the Hmong came from. And that's where the Plain of Jars is. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, or maybe some of you have been there. And it's these ancient stone jars that are, they don't even know how they got there or what they are, but it's a beautiful, beautiful area. And the mountains, and the Hmong lived up in the mountains mostly in small villages and farmed. And so while I was there with my guide, we heard this explosion, this plume of smoke came up, and he explained to me, which I didn't know, about the cluster bombs and other unexploded ordnance that are still in Laos after the war. And as it turns out, I mean, it was very, very disturbing. I was kind of teary-eyed hearing this and knowing, because it was all American bombs that came down, these cluster bombs that we were operating illegally in Laos, and the Hmong were working with us, the CIA, and they were helping because they were afraid of the communists taking over and losing their land. And so anyway, as it turned out, I learned that there are over 80 million cluster bombs still implanted in the ground and in trees and in villages. And since the war, over 20,000 people have died since the war ended. Before, I mean, you know, there were a lot of casualties, of course, before and all the bombing, but since the war ended, there's been over 20,000 people who've either died or been maimed by these cluster bombs. And children are particularly attracted to them because they're just these little balls, and they see them and they think it's a toy. And so they pick them up. So I went home very disturbed by all this, and I wanted to do something. So it just happened, I started looking online, and it just happened that there was this group, Legacies of War, that had formed very recently. And it's a group of Lao refugees whose families came over here when they were small children. And they just started this organization to, number one, make people aware, to tell them what's going on over there, and to try to get more funding for the clearance. And over time, they've been quite successful increasing the amount of funding that the U.S. has provided, and particularly under President Obama, because he went over to Laos and saw the whole thing. And so anyway, I became involved with the group. I was on the board of directors for 6 years. And it took me on quite a journey, because something I'd never in my life thought about doing. And it just seemed so natural, and it was really wonderful, and they're just lovely, lovely people, and it was quite an experience for me. So I went twice with the group from Legacies. The first time we went just to meet with other groups working in this area and this issue, and to meet with some of the government people and so forth. And then the second time, we went for the first meeting of the state parties in the Convention on Cluster Munitions, which had just been formed, like the Landmine Convention. And Laos, of course, was the host, because they are the most heavily bombed place in the world with cluster munitions. And during the war, they were bombed more than was bombed in all of World War II. So you can imagine this small country with only like 6 million people, and they were just bombed to pieces. And so anyway, it was quite a wonderful time to be working on this and doing all of this. So this story, as you know, is about this young métis who's just turning 18 and leaving the orphanage where she was raised, taken from her mother. And I decided I wanted to write another story set in Laos, and I wanted it to be during the colonial period, because the colonial period is what led us to, or led the whole of Indochina to just decades of chaos and 2 wars, because the French would not give up, they wouldn't leave, they insisted on remaining, and that led to the First War, and they finally got rid of them. And then the rest of the world was like, this was when the Cold War was going on and the fight between communists spreading, and it was a crazy, crazy time in the 50s. And Laos was actually more of a focus from the U.S. under Eisenhower, than anywhere else. They were so worried it was going to become a communist country, and the whole domino theory, you know, they were all going to fall. And so anyway, all of that, of course, then eventually led to the Second War. So I felt like this was such a key period in the history of Laos and all of Indochina. And I wanted to write something to talk about that. So I had this idea, okay, I'm going to set this story in French Indochina. What's it going to be about? And I wasn't really quite sure. So I spent a day at UC Davis Library, going through their shelves on Indochina and Laos, and I found just immediately I found this book that had just come out 2 years before called The Uprooted: Race, Children, and Imperialism in French Indochina, and it's by a professor at Cal Poly. And it's the first book that has really dealt with what happened to the mixed race children in France. I mean, in Indochina from the French colonial period, because no one had really written about that before. And the French, I mean, certainly all of Europe was doing this. They had these colonies, they, you know, were taking over and being very hard sometimes on local native people. But in this particular situation, they thought they were doing the right thing. And they were taking these children away from their families, putting them in these orphanages in their own country, and making sure they only spoke French. They only learned to be French citizens, and they weren't allowed to speak their native language. Their parents often were, they didn't know where they were. They didn't know anything about their families. And often they took siblings, sisters and brothers and all, and they separated them and never let them know where they'd gone. It was really quite remarkable. Okay, let's see. So when they first arrived, you know, there were very few French women there, of course, and the Frenchmen, you know, were lonely, so they started having relationships with local people. And at first, the government was like, well, okay, fine, that's all right. And then there started to be a lot of these métis children. And then there were sort of, it was this big dilemma what to do. And early on, if the French father would recognize the child as their child, then they were given French citizenship rights. But in most cases, the fathers spent, you know, a few years there, either in the military or in an administrative job, and then they went home, and they didn't ever bother. They might send a little money for a short while, and then they just forgot about their fusals and their children. They just abandoned them. And the French government thought, well, this isn't right. We should take care of them and make them French citizens. And they wanted more, they were really looking for more people to support the colonial government, to support the colonies. And so they wanted these métis children to become French citizens. So initially, when if they were abandoned, there were Catholic orphanages that were run to help take care of them. But the civilian population didn't feel like the Catholic nuns were doing the right thing, and they were too hard on them, and they weren't helping them enough. So the people who had come from France and were living in all of the colonies formed their own civilian societies for the métis children and opened lay orphanages. And they were privately held and run at this time. And the government, I think, did give them some money. But so in Laos, there was one formed in 1908. So then, post World War I, there was a big debate in France about what to do because, of course, by now the number of métis was getting quite large. And a lot of people were arguing it was only fair to give these children French citizenship and treat them as French. Some didn't agree. There was a big debate, but finally in 1926, they did pass legislation to recognize all these children as French citizens, even if their fathers did not recognize them. And that was a big breakthrough. And so, what did I do? Oh, okay. So I wanted to read you, just to give you an idea of the attitude of a lot of people. The document on the end there. This was written by this man who had been in Vietnam, or in Tonkin, one of the colonies in Vietnam. And he got into trouble. He had several mistresses, and one of them sued him. I don't know exactly what he did wrong, but she sued him, went to court, and he was sentenced to 2 months in jail. And he was just furious. So he wrote this rant about the métis and the mothers. And here's his description of why men take mistresses there. A single Frenchman comes to the colony and soon finds a native companion because it's hard to be alone. And having a companion is an advantage from the point of view of his health. So it really wasn't these Frenchmen''s fault. I mean, they just had to do this. So then, I mean, here's one of his statements about the mothers, the mistresses and the mothers of the métis. The mothers of the métis are always, without exception, from the lowest levels of the native society, and it is not able to be otherwise. And then he said, as a result, the majority of métis children are mostly corrupt and bad as well because of their mothers and the native society, and they dishonor their French fathers. The appropriate term used, sale métis, which means dirty or bad métis, is true in most cases. They are not worthy of being called French. So you can see that it wasn't an easy go. I mean, not everyone felt that way, but there were a lot of French people who felt these métis were really a problem because their mothers were these terrible people who'd had affairs, and they were tainted and they weren't treated well. There was a lot of prejudice that they had to deal with. So then in the 1930s, with the Great Depression, there was a really growing need for more money to care for the métis. And then in 1936, the socialist government was elected in France in the midst of all the craziness going on around them with Germany and the fascists and so forth. And so they did create more funding for the métis and programs to train them for jobs and different things. It was a better time. And then in 1939, they decided the government should take over management of the métis and the orphanages. And so it all came under the French government. And it was called the Jules Brevet Foundation. He was at one time the Governor General of Indochina, which was the person in charge of all of Indochina based in Hanoi. And then each colony had its own resident general. So I'll just tell you about some of my primary sources in can you see all right? Am I in your way? Okay. There were lots of wonderful books that I found, and some basic Lao history books. And then I love this book, The Last Century of Lao Royalty. And that's about Luang Prabang, which is in the north. And when the French came, they allowed Luang Prabang to remain and to be semi-autonomous with their oversight. And over time, that oversight got more and more and more, but they were a little bit separate. And then the French colonial government took over all the rest of Laos. And this is a wonderful book with so much information. And it was in later years that many of the royal family became the central figures in the fight for independence. And then here are some firsthand accounts of the 1920s and 30s in Laos. And this one here was a French book that was really sort of almost like a travel log. They were trying to appeal to people to come and visit Laos. And they had lots of things about their Laos is made up of so many different groups they have different languages and so forth, and throughout all of the mountains and the different villages, many, many different people. They weren't all Lao. And then these two, the King Cobra and East of Siam, were both Americans who came and traveled there, and they wrote essays about them. Very, very prejudiced things they said. It's pretty remarkable if you read these. But I learned a lot. I learned a lot and got a lot of details, which was great. And then the last one was by this woman who was there in 1936, and she used this as her PhD dissertation. And she wrote a much more unbiased account of what it was like there then and the people. So that was very helpful. And then I read these novels. In order to do all this research on this project, I had to vastly improve my college French, which was quite limited. So I took a lot of classes, and I started really concentrating on that. And I will say that the thing that's been the most successful for me is watching Netflix with in other languages with French subtitles, and that's how I learned the most. But yeah, so I read these books, and one is about a young métis in Laos, and that was really interesting. And another one about a Frenchman who marries a girl in Laos. And then the last one is in more a little bit later time frame, but it was so interesting because it was just so sad the way she was treated first by her family, and that was in Vietnam. But first her family abandoned her, and then when the wars started to happen in the 1950s, they took her back, but she was always very poorly treated, very sad. So then my husband and I went back to Laos, and I will say that the Lao government is not fond at all of the French colonial period, to say the least. And if they have any archives, they do not let anyone near them. And I tried, but just a blank wall. But I have friends there who helped me steer me in a few things that I got some good information. At this museum, this is the first prime minister of communist Laos. They had some interesting things just because he was a teenager still during the French colonial period. So there were some references that were helpful. And then I met this woman. I can't say her name correctly, but her pen name is Doc Ed. She's a writer, and her sister's a writer, and they own a bookstore. And very lovely lady. And her father was a very prominent person and writer in Laos, and was the assistant to this Prince Petzerath, who was a very important person. So they were very well connected. And it turns out her grandmother was métis. So that was interesting. So she told me a lot about the attitude there, where her family accepted her, but there was always a little bit of discomfort that she was different, and then her children were different, and so forth. So I got these books from her, the one about Prince Petzerath, and her father wrote this biography of him. And he was a very important person. He was the highest ranking official in the colonial government. And he was instrumental in a lot of things, creating more promoting Lao culture and getting a school for lawyers and other Lao people to become administrators. So he was very helpful in those things. And then he actually was part of one of the first governments that happened at the end of World War II before the French came back. They had formed the first free government, and then the French came back, and they all had to flee to Thailand. I'm working on a sequel, and it's going to this book, and it's going to go through the whole start of the independence movement and all. So then I went to France, to Aix-en-Provence, where they have the colonial archives. And it's on the campus of the University of Aix-en-Provence. And they just have these huge files, and you pull them up, and then you can go through things. And so I went through all the government documents during that period where my book is set. And really fascinating, interesting things. I got so many little details that ended up in the book that I wouldn't have thought about if I hadn't come across them while going through doing this research. But one of my frustrations was that these were government files and the orphanages were private. So until later. And so during the period where my story is set. So I never actually confirmed that there was this orphanage that my character lived in. But I'm assuming because Vientiane was the largest city in Laos, and I know they had to have had a orphanage then. So you do have to be a little bit creative when you're writing fiction. And then we went to Paris, and I went to the National Library. And this was, I came across this document, which was another, interestingly, and some Catholic nuns who went to Laos in 1933 and opened a orphanage for the métis in Tok Hek, which is just south of Vientiane. And that was really interesting, too, to see what they were going through. And then I had a lot of help from my friends who are Lao or involved in Laos. And Mike Boddington lives in Laos, and he was very involved in charity work with healthcare, trying to improve healthcare in Laos. And he helped create a hospital in Laos that works with people who have been injured with cluster bombs and people who lost limbs, and creating artificial limbs for people. And at this hospital, if any of you have been there, there's a museum that's about the cluster bombs, and it's quite a moving exhibit with all these cluster bombs and so forth hanging from the ceiling, and exhibits about what happens. So he was very involved in that, and he also did this big government study documenting how many people have been killed and injured by the cluster bombs and other UXO since the war ended. And then in the middle there is Chanapa Kamphongsa, who was the director of Legacies of War while I was working with them. And she's a wonderful person. So they helped me a lot and sent me in the right directions. And then this is a couple of other friends from the same group. And what a lot of my friends did was help me with spelling and the use of Lao words, Lao customs, Lao food. And I borrowed their names for my characters. Right in the middle there is Sukuna. And my main character, her Lao name is Sukuna. And as it turns out, Sukuna's grandmother was métis. So it's kind of remarkable that you run across it more than you would think you would. So I'll tell you just a little bit about the colonial period in general. Their justification for going is mission illustrice. And you can see from this statement, the superior races have the duty of civilizing the races inferior. So they felt just a little bit superior. And that attitude didn't go away. They thought the Lao people were, especially the more rural and different uh, rural villages and so forth with lots of different religions and beliefs, that they were basically barbarians and they needed to teach them how to be civilized people. So the French took over Vietnam from 1862 to 1883, and they divided it into 3 colonies. Cochin China, where Saigon is in the south, then Annam, which is in the middle, and that was the royal capital was there in High, isn't that right? I can't. Way, thank you. I went blank. And then in the north is Tonkin, where Hanoi is. And then in 1887, they took over Cambodia. And then finally in 1893, they took over Laos. And I'll give you just a short history of Laos. Their golden era was in the 1300s to the 1700s. And you can see the green block of land is Laos, and that was the land sign. And they were very powerful then. Of course, all of these countries or kingdoms were constantly fighting and, you know, taking land, giving land away, etc. And then in the 1700s, Laos split into 3 smaller kingdoms. In the north was the kingdom of Luan Prabang, which survived. And then in the middle was the kingdom of Vientiane. And in the south, the kingdom of Champaksa, which when the French took over, both of those kingdoms sort of dissolved and the leaders went away. They either immigrated to Siam or something. So, and in the 1800s, Siam became very powerful and they were basically running Laos. I mean, they were independent, but they had to pay tribute and they had to have people there to tell them, you know, what they could and couldn't do. So one of the French arguments was they were saving Laos from the Siam. And what they did was in 1893, they sailed their naval boats into the harbor at Bangkok, and they pointed their big guns at them, and they said, "We want half of Laos." And oddly enough, Siam said, "Oh, okay." And they negotiated, and they created what's now basically the same as Laos. There's been a little land going back and forth. And in that process, there's this whole area kind of there. I don't know if you can see, but there was a very large piece of land that was Laos. And it stayed with Siam. And it's now today, it's the area called Isan. And all those people are basically Lao. And my son, who lives in Thailand and is married to a girl who grew up in Isan, and she's Lao. So it really is my karma to be attached to Laos somehow. So, but the main reason that the French wanted Laos was as a buffer, because they were worried that they would try to take over Vietnam and Cambodia. And so they wanted Laos as a buffer. So they divided, as I said, they divided the country up into the Luang Prabang, which remained partial self-rule, and then all the rest. And Vientiane became the capital. And this is a photo from 1929. And you can see it's not a huge place, but, and it had actually, Siam had destroyed so much of Vientiane in taking it over, and it destroyed all the temples and so forth. So they really had to rebuild the whole of it. So life under colonial rule, the population, you can see that the main reason the French were in Indochina was for all of the colonies in Vietnam, because they were very profitable. They had lots of natural resources. They had lots of labor pool, big labor pool, educated people, as well as workers. As you know, they had a lot of rubber plantations. They had mines, lots of, I think, silver and gold. And they built lots of manufacturing. So it was really a real cash cow for France in Vietnam. But Laos was nothing compared to them, really. And you can see from the numbers of French that were actually there that in 1921 in all of Indochina there were 25,000 French. In Laos there were only 361. And you can see in 1931 as well, it's just a very small population, just the basic enough to control things. And so, as I said, there's a very diverse population and many ethnic minorities and languages. And these are just a couple of them from the mountains. Their villages, the Ka and the Hmong. And then there were a lot of Chinese who came to Laos to be in the cities as accountants and administrators. They were because they were well educated, Mandarin Chinese. And this is, but one of the other reasons it was very hard, I mean, they wanted to try to develop Laos, but it was very difficult because it's landlocked. There's no access to the sea. It's very, very mountainous, and villages are sort of inaccessible. It's very hard to build any roads because then the monsoons come and it all gets washed away. So it's really not easy, and there aren't that many natural resources. I mean, there are some. They certainly had a trade in timber and different things like that, and they had a few tea and coffee plantations on the Bulawan Plateau. But anyway, it was the main problem was that the main transportation was along the Mekong River, and that's where all the cities are, of course. And but because of all the barriers from Laos to get to Vietnam, everything that came into Laos usually came through Siam and came to Vientiane and then went up and down the river and boats. But and the French were very frustrated because they wanted it to all come from Vietnam and go into Laos, but that really couldn't happen because the river is navigable all the way from north of Luang Prabang and down to the Cambodian border. But then you run into the Cone Falls. And so you can't get through to go to into Cambodia and on to Saigon in the boat. So what they did was they built this train. They had weekly ferries coming down with the mail and so forth and passengers. And when they got to the Cone Falls, everybody had to get out and get on this little train. And then they'd put the boats up on some train wheels so they could go along the train track. And then they'd go around the falls and they'd all get back on. And it was time consuming and expensive. And so it just didn't promote much in the way of economic development. So this is just some pictures I've taken over time along up in near Luang Prabang with some of the boats. And they're still very, I started late. I'm almost done. They're still the same boats that are like this now that my characters ride in as well. And then, so there was lots of rebellion in Vietnam because people were treated very poorly. They weren't paid adequately, on and on and on. It was a long list of very bad decisions by French employers. And in Laos, that didn't happen because they really weren't working for the French that much. The only exception being that the French had this corvée labor, which was forced labor without pay. And it was like part of the tax system in a way. They had to pay a head tax in the villages and on each person that lived there. And then they had to perform this corvée labor. And that was what really upset the farmers and the people in the villages, because when they first, early on, the French were so clueless, and they would tell these people, you have to come work for us for a month and a half, right in the middle of the harvest or right in the middle of the planting season. And so people were very upset about that. And a lot of times they'd try to run away and escape, but that only made it worse. But so this is a picture of some of the corvée labor building a road, and just by hand going along, stamping the dirt. And the telegraph lines in Laos were everywhere because that was the only way to communicate. There wasn't enough, I mean, you couldn't get anywhere on roads and so forth. So telegraph lines were just essential. I just have a couple more slides. So because there were so French in Laos, they trained the Garde Indochine, which was the local natives were made into a police force and trained for that. And then this picture is so typical. I don't know if any of you have been to Hanoi and to the prison that's there that was the early French. Yeah. And just such horrible things they did to the people that were in there. And you can see these, they were so repressive and harsh, and they just didn't stand for anyone complaining or wanting to change things. And so then I'll just say fact versus fiction. I did have to imagine some things with, but I found lots of good things too, like this 1931 map, which was the year of my book. So with the French names and the temples and so forth and markets. And then these are some buildings that are still there. So I sort of imagine the orphanage my character grows up in being something like those. And then in the book, there are some real people that are not the direct characters in the book, but are important. And one, again, is this Prince Petzrath, because he was working in Vientiane and was very high in the government. And then this is Prince Savunafuma, who later became a major leader in the rebellion and independence of the country, along with a couple of other princes. And he went to school in Paris and became an electrical engineer. And then he came home, and he was very handsome and debonair. And his family wanted to marry him into an arranged marriage with another royal person who was his equal. And he said, no, I want to marry for love. I'm not going to do this. And so he was living in Vientiane, and he met this woman, Elaine Russell, who was a métisse. And they fell in love, and the royal family said, you can't marry her because she's not Lao. She's half French. We won't allow any intermarriage. And he just ignored them and eventually married her anyway. And the court did not accept her for 30 years. And finally, they let her come to the court. I mean, it was pretty remarkable. So this is sort of some inspiration to my characters as well. And these are some of the beautiful temples that I will say the French did spend a lot of money restoring cultural sites like this, and they helped create a special Buddhist school of sort, or center, a research center for the Buddhists. This is the Catholic Church that was built in 1928, and that was where my character and the girls from the orphanage are supposed to be going to a Catholic church. And then these are traditional homes. On the right, you can see what it looks like in a village, very modest with, built of bamboo and thatch roofs. But And then on the right is a really nice home made of teak or rosewood and all carved and beautiful. And but all of them are up to help protect from animals, from scary animals and snakes and so forth. That's the tradition. And then lastly, this is, I just liked this photo. It's a puka fan. Then in 1930, you can get an idea of what things were like. And I think they were invented in India, maybe, but anyway. But by 1930s, they did have electricity, especially in Vientiane. It was a large enough city, so they didn't have to have someone stand there pulling the cord. So that's all of my slides. And let me,
Time for a couple of questions.
yeah.
Is there any question in the? We'll check first.
Okay. I think you have to come. There's a question here.
Yeah, wait, first I had to turn it
Oh,
on.
turn it on.
Yeah, I was interested. That's a very, very interesting talk. And I think
Thank you.
about the Vietnamese women who had children with French men and the girls that came out from that
Right,
and how attractive they were in their out's eye.
right.
And I'm sure the Lao métis
Yeah,
must have been
beautiful.
just as attractive.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. Actually, there were so many Vietnamese living in Laos at this time because the French found the Lao way too easygoing and they didn't hire them for jobs. Well, they didn't have as much education. So there was actually a larger population of Vietnamese living in Vien Chen than there were Lao in 1931.
I'm particularly interested in the PDJ, the Plaine de Jar, because during in the mid 60s there
Right.
was a plateau
Right,
that the Air America and Air Force had, and we had people staying there because they would rescue pilots who were
Right.
who had to bail out over the PDJ. So,
yeah, right,
and then one night the bad guys attacked and took
Right.
it over.
right.
Okay.
I just wanted to find out if you can reiterate about the cluster bombs and how much, how many are left and how do they calculate that?
Okay. Well, we bombed for 9 years, the equivalent of a plane load of bombs every 4 minutes for 9 years. And so you can imagine it was just unbelievable. All the people had to leave or they were killed. They were hiding in caves. They were hiding in ditches. It was remarkable. And there are now mostly along the eastern border near Vietnam, but all up and down because of the Ho Chi Minh Trail and all that. There are close to 80 million unexploded cluster bombs. And there also are still lots of big bombs and rockets and all kinds of unexploded ordnance. It's really amazing. But what they're doing now is they're focusing, of course, on areas where there are villages and farms and trying to clear as much as they can where people are actually living. But it's very difficult. And this administration cut all the funding. I understand that now some of it has been restored after they spent time thinking about it, I guess. So they are just still doing that work, and other countries are contributing a lot. Norway, I know, contributes a lot, and so forth.
Fascinating. Thank you. So as a historical fiction writer, is there a formula that you all use? Like what percentage is your imagination and what percentage is historic,
Oh,
verified facts?
well, I can't say I don't have a formula. I try to make it as close to reality as I can. And, my characters, of course, are not real. So their individual things are from my imagination, but I try to base it on all the things that I know that are real.
Let's thank Elaine.
Okay. Thank you all.